Hello, I'm Baroness Camilla de la Reynarde of the Middle Kingdom, and I'm going to be teaching a netting class. Now, I've got a dowel rod hanging from a frame that I've made out of PVC pipe because it was cheap and the frame will knock down and it's easily carried around. So I've got a dowel rod, I've got a gauge stick, I've got a netting shuttle, and I'm using a large gauge and a large shuttle and large thread because I'm exaggerating for teaching purposes. To cast on, I'm going to start with 2 half hitches and then a knot. And to start with the very first knot, you come behind the gauge, around the dowel, and hold it in place. For the second half, I grab that and I come in behind the dowel, but this time instead of going around the gauge, I go in front of the gauge. I go around the dowel in front of the gauge. There's the knot. That's what it looks like before it's tightened up and seated, and I pull that tight. Now I want to make sure that doesn't come undone, so I make a slightly different knot. I give myself a little more thread to do that. I come behind the gauge, under the dowel, over the gauge. So I have a loop hanging down here that I'm securing with my ring finger. I come through the loop, pick it up off the gauge, and I don't let go of it till it's almost seated. And there it is. So I now have 2 half hitches and a knot. And I don't have a loop yet, but I will with the next one. So I come around the gauge, behind the gauge, under the dowel, over the gauge, and there's my first loop. Now I do another half hitch, this time in front of the gauge, so it looks like that. Pull it tight. And it's almost done, but I want it secure. So I come between the 2 loops, under the dowel, over the gauge. I've got the loop secured on my ring finger. I put the shuttle through the loop, front to back, pick it up off the gauge, hold it securely with the ring finger, and then slide it into place. So this is what it looks like. First half, second half, get it off the gauge, there it is, secure it. Come again between the stitches, between the dowel and the gauge. I've got the loop around my ring finger. The shuttle goes through the loop comes off the gauge, there's the knot, I turn loose, and now it's seated. If you have any questions about what knots I'm using, consult your local Boy Scout. First half hitch, second half hitch in front of the gauge. There they are. That's what they look like. Tighten it up. Separate it out a little bit. Now it's time to secure it. Back to front between the dowel and the gauge. I'm holding the loop with my ring finger. Pop the loop off the gauge. It's still around my ring finger. It's almost in position. And there it goes. You keep doing this until you have the number of loops around the gauge that you want. It's not necessarily the number of stitches up here. They're offset. You have to remember that. So I've got 1, 2, 3. When I complete this one, I'll have 4 meshes. And that's what you want, is a mesh. Now I'm going to do one more again very slowly. Then I'm going to finish casting on, and I'm going to show you how to cast on the other side, and that's what makes it a tube. Once again, very slowly. First half hitch, behind the gauge, over the dowel. Come in behind the dowel, back to front, between the dowel and the gauge. There it is. Second half hitch, in front of the gauge, back to front, around the dowel, over the gauge. That's what it looks like. I have 2 half hitches. When in doubt, consult your local Boy Scout. Snug that into position. Now, I need a knot to secure it. The thread goes around the gauge, between the dowel and the gauge, back to front. The ring finger is holding the thread secure so it doesn't go flailing around. Pick the loop off the gauge. Start sliding it into position. And there it is. Now I'm going to continue casting on until I have the number of meshes that I want. Then I'll flip it over and do the other side. So we stop now. Alright, I've cast on 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 meshes. Now comes the magic trick. I have to flip the frame around. And I'm going to cast on between the first set of loops, so I'll in essence have a complete circle. I know it looks odd, and believe me, it feels odd the first few times you do it, but it's the same procedure. And I've changed thread colors to make the difference more visible. So I still have my dowel rod, my gauge stick, my shuttle, and it's the same procedure. I have the thread in front of the gauge first, and I'll go between these two, same way. It's a little fussier because the thread wants to go over there. And let me make sure that's in here. That would help too. Okay, first half hitch, second half hitch. So you can see it's still 2 half hitches. One goes behind the gauge and one does not. Slide it into place, and I knot it just like I did the ones on the front side. The loop is behind the gauge. I don't want that. I pick it up with the shuttle. I'm holding on to it until the knot gets closer. Turn loose and pull it into place. Then I come between these and separate them out so I've got space to work. The shuttle thread goes behind the gauge. This is the gauge. Under the dowel, this is the dowel, back to front between the 2 green ones. There's the first half hitch. This forms the mesh here. There's the second half hitch. This time the yellow thread is hanging in front of the gauge. Come on over there. There's the 2 half hitches. Like I said, consult your local Boy Scouts. There it is. It didn't want to seat. Pull that snug. Now this is where it gets interesting. You have to come between the 2 yellow ones. Up. Threads around the gauge. I'm holding it with the ring finger. Pick it up so it comes up over the gauge. As it comes close, I turn loose. There it is. So yet again, separate these two. The thread is going around the gauge, to the back of the gauge, over the dowel rod, under the dowel rod, back to front. If you have to, hold that with your hand. There's your first half hitch. There's your mesh. Now you're ready for your second half hitch. There it is. And then tie that. And you just repeat this until you have the number of stitches you want. You cast on half the number of stitches you want on one side, and then you come around, turn it around, and cast on half the stitches on the other side. I have 12 on this side, I want 12 on this side, I have 4. I may go with 13, but you don't want to really exceed the amount you have on the front. Alright, yet again, the thread is along the front of the gauge, it comes around behind the gauge, it goes, lays over the dowel rod, comes under the dowel rod, back to front, and then you have to wiggle it into place. Yes, this is frustrating the first few hundred times. And then the second half, there's the second half of the hitch, second hitch. Then the knot between the two yellow ones. Pick it up off the gauge, and there. And just continue on till you have the same number of stitches on the front or one more. This could be your last stitch here between those two, or if the count doesn't work out right or you want an extra one, put another one over here. And that's that. 1. Alright, I have cast on the second side 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12 meshes. I'm going to go ahead and put one more mesh on here. Remember, it comes around the gauge, under the dowel rod, over the gauge stick. There's the first half of the hitch. There's the second hitch. It goes around the dowel rod, over the gauge. Looks like that. And then you knot it. So now I have 2 gauge sticks, 2 sets of knots. And now it is time to flip the frame again, because I'm working left to right. And I'm going to pull this gauge stick out, bring it around so it can work here on the green ones. So again, I bring the thread around the gauge stick, through the mesh, hold it, missed it there. Get that organized there. Pinch it, throw a loop around, come under both parts of this loop, this mesh, through the loop formed by the yellow thread, pull it, pull it, pull it, turn it loose at the last second. There it is. This is called a sheet bend knot. Again, consult your local Boy Scout. So this is all you do. You follow the gauge stick around, put the shuttle up the loop, pinch it, throw the shuttle thread around, so it forms a loop, come up behind the mesh, through the loop formed by that. You can see how it's going around there. Pull it, pull it, pull it, and then turn loose. There. And just keep following it around. The size of the thread determines the size of the knot, but the size of the gauge determines the size of the mesh. So I need my next green loop. Come up through the green loop, the green mesh, pinch it, throw around a loop, come around there, under the mesh, and there. That one made it pop back. Wasn't seating quite correctly. So I've got this around the front of the gauge. You come up around the back of the gauge, through the mesh, scoot it along, and yes, ultimately these will fall off the back of the gauge stick. Do not worry. Now that you've knotted it, you don't need the gauge stick to maintain the size of the mesh. So I've got this draped around the front of the gauge stick. I'm pinching it into place, making a loop, coming up under that mesh, holding on with my thumb until it's almost there, and there it is. You can see the two colors blending very well. One more time. So I free that from there, come up, the thread is around the front of the gauge, it goes around the back of the gauge, and it comes up in the mesh, there, just like that. Scoot the gauge along a little bit, pinch it, make your loop, come under your mesh, through that loop, there's your knot, hold it till the last second, pull. Now you repeat it 10,000 times. Feels a little odd going around the corners and flipping it. It does get easier. It hangs a little weird at first, but after you've done a row or two and gotten away from the cast on part, it goes easier. It seems like a lot of thread going all over the place. Once you get the hang of it, you start to be able to figure out what is going where. One more time, and in the next segment, I'll show you how to increase. Okay, the thread's going around the front of the gauge, coming up around the back of the gauge, going through the mesh, holding that tight, making a loop, coming under that mesh. There's your knot. Remember, it's called a sheet bend knot. Consult with a Boy Scout in your area, and there it is. And then in the next segment, I'll show you how to increase so it will grow. Alright, I have just finished netting this entire row, and now I'm ready to turn and start increasing. So I pick up my netting frame and I turn it around, and I move the gauge stick, like so, and I make it turn around too. So I am going to net in this mesh. So again, the thread is in front of the gauge. The shuttle comes up through there. Pinch it, make the loop, bring it through. Now I want to increase. So I make sure I know where the next one is, and then I come up between these meshes in the previous row. I've got my next mesh, I've got the knot in the previous row. So I'm going to come up here. So I come up in that mesh space. You have to jiggle it a little bit to make sure everything stays level. Make the knot and just make sure that the knot seats above the previous knot. I know it's hard to see, but there it is. So now I bring down the next mesh. So I've got the knot in the first mesh, the knot in the mesh above it in the previous row. Now I'm going to go into this one. Scoot the gauge along, come up through the mesh, pinch it around. Don't turn loose till it's almost seated. There. Now, increase by coming up in this one in the previous row. Pinch it. Make sure the gauge is level with the previous mesh. Make your loop. Come around. Make sure you don't catch any other meshes. Get them out of the way if you have to. Pinch it and knot. Now this will make a geometric increase. Instead of having 12 meshes per side, I'll have 24. So if you want lesser increase, do it every other one, every third one. So again, around the gauge, up from behind the mesh, pinch it, make your loop, come through your loop, and there. Find the mesh in the previous row, come up through there, slide that on down, make sure it's level, make sure you're in the right space, throw your loop, come through there, there. One more time. Thread in front of the gauge, come up back to front in the mesh, pinch it, make your loop, come up in the loop. Tried to get sloppy on me. There. One last increase, the mesh in the previous row. Scoot that along. A little more thread, make your loop through there and there, and stop. Alright, I've done my cast on, I've done my increases, I've done a regular row or two, and now it's time to bind off. Now if you want to decrease, after you flip this around, if you want to decrease, you could simply come through two meshes at once and then make your knot. So you can see that I've come through two. But I'm binding on. I'm not decreasing. But if you wanted to decrease, you could come through these two and tie your knot into both, and that would be a decrease. Or you could do like I'm about to do in binding off and just do every other mesh. So I'm going to skip this mesh and then knot in this one. So it's still the same thing, I'm just skipping every other one. So I'm doing every other one. Just the same knot. But as you do that, it creates a flatter surface. Instead of having the scalloped edge as we've had in previous rows, now we have more of a straight edge. And this will come in handy, as I'll show you here in a minute. I'm going to put that back on the gauge and go through every other mesh, just the same as I've been doing. Every other mesh. Same knot, nothing changes. And yes, you are going to have to kind of grab it and play with it to find the mesh you need. There. Now, this is the result when you do every other mesh. You get an edge that looks like this. That's where I skipped the mesh, and now it's making more of a straight line. And when you're making hairnets, this gives you a built-in drawstring line. You can see how the elastic is going through the mesh I didn't work and the mesh that I did. This way, it gives you the drawstring area. So that's how you bind off. And then when you get to the end, you just tie the thread into the first mesh and cut it, and you're done. Alright, we've cast on, we've done the netting, we've done an increase, and we've bound off. Now it's time to get it off the stick. There's two different ways to do this, and there's period examples that show both methods. So it just depends on what effect you want. But they all start by scooting this up to the end of your dowel rod and then slipping the knots off. And if you cast them on correctly, they unfold a bit and make the long float that you see in the period hairnets. Now, as I said, there's two ways to do this, and I've got some thread that I'm going to put through the loops. You can use silk ribbons, tiny silk ribbons, or tiny finger loop braiding. All that's period. So it just depends on what effect you want. If you just go and slide these off, and you can see the difference, color difference between the front stitches and the back stitches, then it's going to close like a zipper. And if you want it to close like a zipper, that's fine. If you don't, if you want it to close in a circular pattern, then you have to slide the stitches off and capture every other one. But make sure you flop that float out to get the look. So I'm only going to do the green stitches and leave the yellow ones to the side, follow them around later. And that's all you do. You have to decide if you want it to close like a zipper or in a circle. And we can stop for the moment. As you can see, I've run the drawstring through all the green loops and then all the yellow loops, and then the size of the circle that makes depends on how tight I pull that. Remember, there's documentation for both doing this in a circle and doing every other one like a zipper. So it just depends on which hairnet you are trying to recreate. But you can see we've got the long float that you see in medieval hairnets. We've got our mesh stitch. We've got our increase row. Then we've got a regular row. And then we have our decrease with the straight edge and the loop there. So you can run a drawstring through there. Now remember, the size of the knot determines, or the size of the thread determines the size of the knot. The size of the gauge determines the size of the mesh, and I am exaggerating for teaching purposes. This is done with size 10 crochet thread, which is very large, very large. This is done with size 20 pearl cotton cordonette, I believe it was. And this is what your hairnet could look like. Now, ideally, you should use silk. From what little research I've done on this, I have not seen any mention of anything other than silk. And as much time as it's going to take, you don't want to use anything less than silk. So I hope this has been helpful, and good luck with your hairnet.